The modern seeker confronts a peculiar crisis, the dismemberment of the human being. Contemporary civilization, with its materialist reductionism and psychological fragmentation, has carved the individual into isolated components, neurons firing without meaning, behaviors without essence, consciousness without cosmos. Yet beneath this dissection lies an ancient and persistent question that has haunted philosophers, mystics, and depth psychologists alike. What is the complete structure of human existence? What are the true constituents of being? The doctrine of the three bodies, Corpus, Anima, Spiritus, represents not merely an archaic taxonomy, but a sophisticated philosophical architecture for understanding the totality of human experience. This tripartite division appears with remarkable consistency across traditions. The Egyptian Khat, Ka and Ba, the Vedantic Sthula Sharira, Sukshma Sharira, and Karana Sharira, the Hermetic Soma, Psyche, and Pneuma. Such convergence suggests not superstition, but a phenomenological observation of existence itself. Hermes Trismegistus, that mythical architect of Western esotericism, encoded this structure in the Emerald Tablet. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below. The human being becomes the microcosm, reflecting the macrocosmic order, body corresponding to the material world, soul to the intermediary realm of formation, spirit to the divine source. Paracelsus, the Renaissance physician-philosopher, elaborated this framework in his medical writings, insisting that true healing required understanding all three dimensions of the patient. Eliphas Levi brought this structure into dialogue with Kabbalah, identifying the three bodies with the triadic structure of the tree of life itself. Carl Jung, approaching from the vantage of empirical psychology, rediscovered this ancient architecture in his concept of the psyche's layered structure: ego, personal unconscious, and collective unconscious, each corresponding to a body of being. Manly Palmer Hall, in his encyclopedic The Secret Teachings of All Ages, traced this doctrine through mystery schools, from Orphism to Rosicrucianism, demonstrating its role as the fundamental anthropology of initiatic wisdom. The true secret here is not a formula to be memorized, but a map to be inhabited. The three bodies doctrine represents an invitation to vertical consciousness, to recognize oneself as simultaneously earthbound and celestial, temporal and eternal, manifest and transcendent. For the contemporary individual severed from traditional cosmologies, this teaching offers not escape, but integration, a way to make sense of the irreducible complexity of human experience without reducing it to mere biology or inflating it to pure spirit. The doctrine of the three bodies constitutes a complete ontological system, a scaffold upon which the entire structure of esoteric anthropology rests. At its foundation lies a radical premise. The human being is not a singular entity, but a composite existence, a confederation of distinct yet interpenetrating dimensions, each operating according to its own laws, yet contributing to a unified whole. The physical body, Corpus. The first body is the material vehicle, the soma of Greek philosophy, the guff of Kabbalistic thought. This is the body of flesh, bone, and biochemistry, the domain of physicians and physiologists. Yet in esoteric understanding, the physical body is not mere matter but condensed consciousness, spirit made visible, the final precipitation of cosmic forces into tangible form. It is governed by the laws of nature: gravity, entropy, hunger, fatigue, decay. This body begins at birth and ends at death. It is temporal, finite, subject to the vicissitudes of the material world. But here we encounter the first crucial distinction. The esoteric traditions do not denigrate the physical body as prison or illusion, as certain dualistic heresies have done. Rather, they recognize it as the necessary foundation, the altar upon which the great work must be performed. Without the physical body there can be no experience, no transformation, no incarnation of spirit. The Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below, implies that the body is itself sacred, a temple housing consciousness. The soul body, Anima. The second body is the psychic vehicle, the seat of personality, emotion, thought, and imagination. This is the nephesh of Hebrew cosmology, the psyche of Greek philosophy, the astral body of theosophical literature. It is the intermediary realm, the bridge between matter and spirit, the domain of subjective experience. The soul body possesses its own substance, not physical matter but psychic matter, what the Neoplatonists called the pneuma, a subtle substance that shapes and is shaped by consciousness. This is the realm that Jung mapped so thoroughly, the personal unconscious with its complexes and shadows, the ego with its identifications and defenses, the anima and animus mediating between conscious and unconscious. The soul body is where biography lives, your memories, traumas, desires, fears, the entire content of your psychological existence. Crucially, the soul body extends beyond the physical and continues after bodily death, according to esoteric teaching. This is not the eternal spirit, but the individuated personality, which must itself eventually dissolve or be transformed. The Egyptians recognized this in their concept of the Ka, the double that survives physical death but is not itself immortal. The Tibetan Bardo teachings describe the journey of this soul body through intermediate states, its gradual dissolution or its potential for conscious navigation. The connection to Jungian psychology becomes explicit here. Jung's analytical psychology is, in essence, the science of the soul body, the work of individuation, confronting the shadow, integrating the anima, animus, encountering archetypal forces, occurs primarily in this dimension. The soul body is plastic, capable of being reshaped through inner work, which explains both the possibility of psychological transformation and the danger of psychological colonization by destructive patterns. The spirit body, Spiritus. The third body is the divine spark, the pneuma hagion, the Atman of Vedantic philosophy, the neshama of Kabbalah. This is not a body in the conventional sense, but the principle of pure consciousness, the eternal witness, the fragment of divinity residing within the human constitution. The spirit body is uncreated and undying. It is not personal but transpersonal, not individual but universal. This dimension corresponds to what Jung cautiously called the self, that center and circumference of the total psyche which transcends the ego yet manifests through it. The spirit body is the destination of all mystical longing, the God within sought by the Gnostics, the Buddha nature of Zen Buddhism. It is simultaneously the ground of being and the apex of consciousness. The critical point here is that the spirit body is not achieved but realized. It does not develop. It is always already present. The entire project of esoteric work is not to create or manufacture spirit, but to remove the obstructions that prevent its recognition. As Meister Eckhart taught, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. Interconnections and operations. These three bodies are not separate but nested, interpenetrating like Russian dolls or the concentric circles of Dante's cosmology. The physical body is permeated by the soul body. The soul body is illuminated by the spirit body. Actions in one dimension affect the others. Physical illness can manifest as psychological disturbance. Spiritual awakening can precipitate psychological crisis. Psychological integration can improve physical health. The Kabbalistic tree of life provides a perfect symbolic map of this structure. The lowest triad, Malkuth Yesod Hod Netzach, corresponds to the physical etheric body. The middle triad, Tifereth Gebura Chesed, to the soul body. The supernal triad, Kether Chokma Bina, to the spirit body. The central pillar represents the path of integration, the ascent and descent of consciousness through these levels. The Neoplatonic tradition offers another lens. The one, spirit, the nous, soul, and the cosmos, body, reflect the same triadic structure at the macrocosmic level. The human being, as microcosm, recapitulates this entire cosmic architecture within their own being. Plotinus taught that the return to the One requires traversing these levels in reverse, ascending through progressive purification and contemplation. The mindset of the adept, to work consciously with the three bodies, requires what might be called vertical consciousness, the capacity to simultaneously inhabit multiple levels of being and to navigate between them with intentionality. This is distinct from ordinary consciousness, which identifies exclusively with one level, usually the ego personality of the soul body, and mistakes that fragment for the whole. The magical will, in esoteric parlance, is precisely this capacity to direct consciousness across dimensions, to bring spiritual light into psychic darkness, to manifest psychic intention in physical action, to align all three bodies toward a single purpose. This is not willpower in the conventional sense, but a kind of ontological coherence, an alignment of being across all levels. The The ethical disposition of the true adept is skepticism toward their own certainty. The beginner mistakes psychic phenomena for spiritual realization, emotional states for gnosis, altered consciousness for transformation. The mature practitioner maintains what the Buddhist tradition calls beginner's mind, an openness that does not confuse the map for the territory, the experience for the experiencer, the symbol for the symbolized. The transformation of the three bodies is not theoretical, but operational, a concrete series of stages through which consciousness must pass to achieve integration. This is the great work, the magnum opus, the path of individuation that Jung spent his life mapping. We can identify 7 major phases, each corresponding to a fundamental operation within the human constitution. The journey begins not with enlightenment, but with disillusionment. The aspirant awakens to the fundamental fact of their own internal division. They recognize that they are not one but many, contradictory impulses, competing desires, fragmented sub-personalities that vie for control of consciousness. The physical body demands comfort and pleasure. The soul body seeks meaning and relationship. The spirit body calls toward transcendence, and these demands frequently conflict. Psychologically, this corresponds to the initial confrontation with the shadow in Jungian analysis. The individual encounters aspects of themselves they have disowned or repressed, the aggressive impulses hidden beneath social politeness, the neediness concealed by apparent independence, the grandiosity masked by false humility. This recognition is profoundly destabilizing. The comfortable fiction of a unified self collapses. In traditional esoteric language, this is the stage of awakening or disillusionment. The Hermetic maxim applies, "Know thyself." But this knowing is not pleasant. It is the painful recognition of internal chaos. The aspirant realizes they are not the master of their house, but merely one voice among many, in an internal parliament where no faction holds clear authority. The work at this stage is observation without judgment, developing the capacity to witness the internal drama without immediately identifying with any particular character. This cultivates what psychology calls the observing ego, and what esoteric traditions call the witness consciousness, the beginning of vertical awareness that can observe the operations of the soul body from a position slightly above it. Having recognized division, the aspirant must first descend before they can ascend. This phase involves a deliberate and full incarnation into the physical body, not as a prison to be escaped, but as a foundation to be claimed. Too much esoteric work is premature spiritualization, attempting to bypass the physical and psychological dimensions in favor of pure transcendence. This is spiritual bypassing, and it leads not to liberation, but to dissociation. The descent into the body means accepting materiality, mortality, limitation. It means inhabiting sensation fully, recognizing hunger, fatigue, desire, pain as legitimate voices rather than obstacles. In psychological terms, this is integration with the instinctual layer of the psyche, what Jung called the shadow's deepest roots in biological drives. Practically, this phase often involves somatic practices, yoga, martial arts, ritual movement, or simply learning to be present in sensation. It may involve confronting issues of health, sexuality, vitality. The esoteric practitioner discovers that transcendence without embodiment is fantasy, that spirit cannot properly operate through an unintegrated physical vehicle. The alchemical operation here is coagulation, the fixing of volatile spiritual aspirations into concrete embodied practice. The symbol is the descent of the dove, spirit, into matter, the incarnation principle enacted individually. The risk is getting lost in materialism, mistaking the foundation for the destination. The necessity is honoring the physical as the ground upon which all further work depends. With the physical body claimed as conscious ground, attention turns to the soul body's first layer, the personal unconscious. This is the repository of all that the ego has rejected, repressed, or simply not integrated, the shadow in its personal dimension. This phase demands rigorous honesty. The aspirant must examine their biography, their conditioning, their defense mechanisms. They must ask, what parts of myself have I disowned to maintain my self-image? What emotions have I deemed unacceptable? What desires have I judged as shameful? The answers are never comfortable. Jung's method of active imagination becomes crucial here, dialoguing with the shadow, giving it voice and form, listening to its complaints and demands. The shadow often appears in dreams as the feared or despised figure, the same-sex character, who embodies what we reject in ourselves. The work is not to eliminate the shadow, but to integrate it, to reclaim its energy without being possessed by it. This is the alchemical separatio, the differentiation of mixed elements, the sorting of gold from lead within the psyche. The practitioner learns to distinguish between legitimate needs and neurotic demands, between suppressed anger that must be expressed and destructive rage that must be transformed. The esoteric danger is inflation, identifying with shadow material and acting it out rather than integrating it consciously. The person who discovers their repressed anger might become tyrannical. The one who finds their hidden grandiosity might become insufferable. True shadow work produces humility, not permission for bad behavior. It expands consciousness without collapsing moral discernment. Beyond the personal shadow lies a deeper layer, the collective unconscious, the archetypal dimension that Jung spent his career exploring. Here, the soul body encounters forces that transcend individual biography, the great images and patterns that structure human experience across cultures and epochs. The aspirant meets the archetypes, the great mother in her nurturing and devouring aspects, the wise old man as guide and judge, the hero's journey with its trials and triumphs, the anima or animus as contrasexual soul guide. These are not mere concepts, but living presences within the psyche, autonomous forces that possess their own intelligence and intentionality. This phase is perilous. The ego, encountering these vast transpersonal energies, risks being overwhelmed. Psychological inflation becomes a real danger. The individual identifies with the archetype rather than relating to it. The man who encounters the hero archetype might believe himself chosen for a world-saving mission. The woman who touches the great mother might lose herself in codependent nurturing or, conversely, in destructive rage. The hermetic wisdom here is critical. The adept must maintain distinction between ego and archetype while allowing dialogue between them. This is the operation of conjunctio at the psychological level, the sacred marriage between consciousness and the unconscious, between ego and archetype, producing not fusion, but relationship. In esoteric symbolism, this is the descent into the underworld, the catabasis that every initiate must undergo. Orpheus descending for Eurydice, Inanna stripped of her regalia at each gate, Persephone dwelling in Hades. These myths encode the psychological truth that consciousness must journey into the depths of the collective unconscious to retrieve treasures buried there. The practical work involves learning to relate to archetypal energies without being possessed by them. Through ritual meditation, active imagination and symbolic engagement, the practitioner develops what might be called archetypal literacy, the capacity to recognize these forces, honor their autonomy, and work with them consciously. The archetypal work culminates in what alchemy calls the conjunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. Within the soul body, consciousness has encountered fundamental polarities, masculine and feminine, light and dark, active and passive, order and chaos. These are not merely social constructs, but archetypal principles that structure psychic energy. For Jung, this is the integration of anima, the feminine soul image in men, and animus, the masculine soul image in women. But this operation extends beyond gender to all fundamental polarities within the psyche. The intellectual must integrate feeling, the feeler must develop thinking, the introvert must claim extroverted capacities, the extrovert must develop interiority. This is extraordinarily difficult work. The psyche resists such integration because it threatens established identity structures. The person who has built their entire self-concept around rationality experiences terror when powerful emotions arise. The one who has survived through pleasing others feels existential dread when asserting boundaries. The alchemical symbol is the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage of king and queen, Sol and Luna, sulfur and mercury. This marriage is not fusion but a third thing, the birth of the divine child, the integrated self that contains both poles in creative tension. The hermetic image is the rebis, the two-headed androgen, simultaneously masculine and feminine, representing psychic wholeness. The practical manifestation is increased psychological flexibility. The integrated individual can access both poles as situations require, can be both receptive and assertive, both analytical and intuitive, both disciplined and spontaneous. They are no longer imprisoned by one-sided identifications. At the threshold between soul and spirit lies the most difficult passage, what mystical traditions call the dark night of the soul, what alchemy describes as the nigredo, the blackening. This is not merely psychological depression, but a necessary ontological crisis. Having integrated the personal unconscious and engaged the collective unconscious, having unified psychological polarities, the aspirant now confronts a final barrier. The soul body itself must be purified and, to some degree, dissolve. All the structures of personality, all the identifications that constitute the ego, must be relativized in preparation for genuine spiritual awakening. This phase often manifests as a collapse of meaning. Everything that once seemed important, ambitions, relationships, beliefs, loses its grip. The person enters a kind of existential desert where the old forms have died, but the new has not yet been born. The psychological certainties that sustained them dissolve. The archetypal energies that once felt numinous now seem hollow. This is not pathological depression, though it may resemble it phenomenologically. The difference lies in the telos, the directedness toward transformation rather than mere suffering. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, all the great mystical psychologists describe this necessary destruction of the egoic personality structures. The danger is nihilism, mistaking the dissolution of form for the absence of meaning, the death of the ego for the death of consciousness itself. The work here is surrender without collapse, what the traditions call active passivity, allowing the process while maintaining the witnessing awareness that can navigate it. The soul body must be refined to the point of translucency, where it no longer obscures the spirit body but becomes an instrument for its expression. This requires releasing attachments, not to people or activities per se, but to the psychological investments that keep us locked in patterns of grasping and aversion. From the depths of the dark night emerges the possibility of genuine spiritual awakening. This is not the acquisition of something new, but the recognition of what has always been present. The spirit body, the eternal witness, the consciousness that precedes and survives all content. This realization has been described across traditions with remarkable consistency. The Satori of Zen, the Moksha of Vedanta, the Gnosis of Christian mysticism, the Unio Mystica of Western esotericism. It is the direct, non-conceptual recognition of consciousness as such, not the contents of consciousness, but the light by which all contents are known. Jung called this encounter with the self, that paradoxical center, which is both most intimate and most transcendent, both the ground of the ego and that which infinitely exceeds it. The self is not constructed through psychological work. It is revealed when the obstructions are removed. Psychologically, this manifests as a fundamental shift in identity. The individual no longer identifies primarily with the ego personality or even with the soul body, but recognizes themselves as the awareness that witnesses all three bodies. There is still personality, still emotion and thought, still physical sensation, but the center of gravity has shifted from the contents to the context, from the waves to the ocean. The esoteric teaching here is unambiguous. You are not the body, not the soul, but the spirit that animates both. Yet this realization does not mean abandonment of the lower bodies, but their transfiguration. The enlightened person does not escape the world, but returns to it with transformed understanding and capacity for action. Let us dwell with brutal honesty on the most treacherous passage, the dark night of the soul, the nigredo, the descent into psychological and spiritual oblivion that stands as the necessary gateway between soul and spirit. This is not a metaphor or poetic exaggeration, but a concrete phenomenological reality that every serious practitioner must eventually face. The crisis begins with the collapse of what might be called spiritual bypass structures, those preliminary insights and experiences that sustained the aspirant through earlier phases of work. The beginner encounters synchronicities, has dreams of symbolic richness, feels the numinous quality of archetypal engagement, experiences moments of expanded consciousness that seem to validate the entire enterprise. These experiences are real but preliminary, the psychological equivalent of training wheels. The dark night arrives when these supporting structures are removed, synchronicities cease, dreams become banal or absent. Meditation, which once produced profound states, now yields only boredom or agitation. The archetypes which felt like living presences now seem like convenient fictions. Most devastating, the sense of meaning itself, the teleological conviction that this work serves some higher purpose, dissolves. This is not ordinary depression, which maintains its object, I am depressed about my job, my relationship, my health. This is ontological despair, a collapse of the meaning-making function itself. The person experiences themselves as fundamentally hollow, their entire psychological edifice revealed as arbitrary construction, their deepest convictions exposed as wishful thinking. The phenomenology of dissolution. What makes this crisis so severe is that it attacks the root of identity. The ego, which has been systematically deconstructed through shadow work and archetypal engagement, now discovers that the observing self it retreated into is also a construct. Even the sense of being on a spiritual path, of engaging in a meaningful transformational process, is revealed as another form of identification, another way the ego attempts to secure itself. The psychological structures that organized experience, the narrative self that interprets events, the evaluating self that judges progress, the aspiring self that aims toward goals, all of these temporarily cease to function. What remains is raw existence without orientation, consciousness without meaning, being without purpose. Psychologically, this resembles the phenomenon Jung described as ego death, not metaphorical, but experiential. The person may report feelings of unreality, depersonalization, or derealization. They may lose interest in activities that once defined them, relationships that once anchored them, beliefs that once oriented them. They are not suicidal in the conventional sense, but experience a kind of ontological exhaustion, a weariness of being itself. The alchemical necessity. Why is this necessary? Why must the aspirant pass through this particular hell? The answer lies in the nature of spiritual transformation itself. Genuine awakening to the spirit body cannot occur while consciousness remains identified with the soul body. As long as the ego personality, however refined and developed, remains the center of gravity, spiritual realization is impossible. The soul body, in all its richness and complexity, is ultimately a created thing, an emergent property of consciousness interacting with experience over time. It has a beginning, at birth or perhaps conception, undergoes development, and will have an end, at death or in the dissolution beyond death. The spirit body, by contrast, is uncreated and eternal. For consciousness to recognize itself as spirit, it must disidentify completely from the soul. But this disidentification cannot be achieved through willpower or technique. The ego cannot transcend itself through effort, because effort itself is an egoic operation. The only way consciousness can release its identification with the soul body is through the exhaustion of that identification, through the soul body itself becoming transparent, inadequate, incapable of sustaining the sense of self. This is the alchemical negredo, the blackening, the putrefaction of the old form necessary before the new can emerge. The metal must be completely reduced to prima materia, undifferentiated base matter, before it can be reconstituted as gold. The personality must be dissolved before the true self can be realized. The psychological distinction from pathology. How is this necessary spiritual crisis distinguished from clinical depression or psychological breakdown? The question is crucial because the phenomenology can be nearly identical. Several factors differentiate them. First, intentionality. The person in the dark night has consciously engaged in transformative work. They have deliberately deconstructed ordinary consciousness and are now dealing with the consequences. This is not a random affliction, but the result of a chosen path. Second, presence of witnessing. Even in the depths of the dark night, there remains a capacity for observation, a thread of awareness that can notice the process. In severe pathological depression, this witnessing capacity itself may collapse. Third, absence of biological markers. While the dark night can certainly affect physiology, it does not typically present with the clear biological symptoms of major depression, disrupted sleep architecture, anhedonia extending to all domains, psychomotor retardation. The suffering is existential rather than hedonic. Fourth, trajectory. Clinical depression tends toward entropy, a progressive narrowing of possibility. The dark night, while it may last weeks or months, has an inherent teleology. It moves toward resolution, toward breakthrough rather than breakdown. That said, the two can certainly coincide. A person undergoing necessary spiritual crisis may also develop clinical depression requiring treatment. The traditions recognize this. John of the Cross, who gave us the most detailed map of the dark night, distinguished between the purgation necessary for spiritual advancement and the melancholy requiring medical intervention. The work within the crisis. What does one do in the dark night? The traditions offer surprisingly consistent guidance. Endure with consciousness. This is not passive suffering but active patience, maintaining awareness even as meaning collapses, observing the dissolution without trying to escape or fix it, neither resisting the process nor identifying with the despair. The practices shift in this phase. Intensive meditation or complex psychological work may be counterproductive. Instead, simple presence, walking, being in nature, basic physical maintenance, connection with others who understand the process. The practitioner maintains the forms of practice not because they yield results, but as acts of fidelity to the process itself. What sustains the aspirant through this darkness is not hope, which is just another form of future orientation that the dark night destroys, but something deeper, trust. Not belief that everything will work out, but a foundational trust in the process itself, in the wisdom encoded in these traditions across millennia, in the possibility that this dissolution serves a purpose, even if that purpose is utterly opaque. The dark night ends not through achievement, but through grace, through a shift in consciousness that cannot be forced or predicted. At some point, the exhaustion becomes complete, the old structures fully dissolved, and in that emptiness, something else becomes visible, the consciousness that was present all along, witnessing even the despair, the unchanging awareness that survives the collapse of all content. What emerges from the crucible of the dark night is not a new personality, but a new relationship to personality, a fundamental shift in the center of identity from soul to spirit, from content to context, from the waves to the ocean. This is the fruit of the great work, the philosopher's stone not as a physical substance, but as a transformed state of being. The realized condition, the individual who has traversed this path experiences their three bodies in proper hierarchy and relationship. The physical body is no longer experienced as the totality of self, but as an instrument, a vehicle for consciousness that requires care and maintenance, but does not define identity. Sensation, health, aging are engaged pragmatically rather than identified with existentially. The soul body, the personality with its memories, preferences, emotional patterns, intellectual capacities, is likewise held more lightly. It continues to function, perhaps more effectively than before, but it is recognized as a constructed interface between consciousness and world rather than as the self itself. The person has preferences but is not enslaved by them, has opinions but is not imprisoned by belief, has emotions but is not overwhelmed by them. The spirit body is recognized as the true subject, not an object of awareness, but awareness itself, the witnessing consciousness that precedes all content. This is what the Upanishads point to in the phrase neti neti, not this, not that, a consciousness that cannot be identified with any object of awareness because it is the subject for which all objects appear. This recognition produces what might be called ontological security, a sense of being grounded in something that cannot be threatened because it is not contingent. Physical death will destroy the body. Psychological change will alter the personality, but the consciousness that witnesses both remains untouched. This is not a belief, but a direct recognition. Psychological integration. From a Jungian perspective, this represents the culmination of individuation, the full differentiation and integration of psychic contents around the self as organizing center. The ego is no longer inflated to totality, but takes its rightful place as the executive function of consciousness, implementing the directives of the deeper self. This manifests as increased psychological flexibility and resilience. The integrated individual can access the full range of human capacities, can be vulnerable and boundaried, soft and firm, receptive and assertive as circumstances require. They are not locked into one-sided identifications or defensive patterns. The shadow has been sufficiently integrated that its energies are available rather than disruptive. Crucially, this integration does not produce perfection or infallibility. The enlightened person still has a personality with its quirks and limitations. They still experience emotions, including difficult ones. They still make mistakes. What changes is the relationship to all of this. There is less resistance, less grasping, less identification with psychological weather patterns. Ethical application. The transformation of the three bodies inevitably produces ethical consequences. The person who recognizes their true nature as spirit, who has encountered that same spirit in the depths of their own being, cannot help but recognize it in others. This produces what might be called ontological empathy, not just emotional resonance, but a recognition of shared being. This is the foundation of genuine ethics, not based on rules or social contract, but on direct recognition of unity at the level of spirit. To harm another is to harm that which one is. To serve another is to serve the self that manifests through apparent multiplicity. This is the secret behind the ethical injunctions of all great spiritual traditions, not arbitrary commandments, but descriptions of how one naturally acts when one sees truly. The integrated individual typically demonstrates several characteristic ethical qualities: humility, arising from recognition that their achievements are not personal possessions, but gifts of grace; compassion, arising from intimate knowledge of suffering and its causes; equanimity, arising from the capacity to observe without being overwhelmed; authenticity, arising from the dissolution of false selves and defensive structures; practical engagement. How does such a person engage with the world? Not through withdrawal into solitary contemplation, but through transformed participation. They engage occupation, relationship, creative work, perhaps with even greater commitment than before, but from a different center with different motivation. Action is no longer driven by ego needs for validation, security, significance. These are seen as ultimately unreal attempts to secure a self that is itself a construct. Instead, action arises from response to what the present moment calls for, from alignment with deeper intelligence, from what the Taoists call Wu Wei, effortless action that flows from understanding of the Tao. This produces a paradoxical quality: great engagement combined with fundamental detachment. The person may work intensely toward goals, but without the internal desperation that usually accompanies ambition. They form deep relationships, but without the possessiveness and neediness that distorts love. They care passionately about outcomes, while simultaneously accepting whatever unfolds. The continuing path. Yet even this realization is not an end point, but a new beginning. The recognition of the spirit body does not mean the soul body ceases to require work. Psychological patterns may still arise requiring integration. New dimensions of shadow may be revealed. Deeper layers of conditioning may surface. The difference is that this work is now conducted from the perspective of spirit observing soul, rather than soul trying to fix itself. Moreover, realization admits of degrees. The initial recognition of one's true nature as consciousness itself may be clear and undeniable, yet the stable embodiment of that recognition requires continued practice and integration. The traditions speak of sahaja samadhi, natural continuous stabilization of awakened consciousness even in the midst of ordinary activity. This is the fruit of years or decades of post-awakening integration. The mature practitioner understands that spiritual awakening is not an escape from the human condition, but a transformation of one's relationship to it. They do not transcend the three bodies, but learn to navigate and utilize them with increasing skill and wisdom. The body remains a body with its needs and limitations. The soul remains a soul with its patterns and preferences, but both are now recognized as expressions of spirit, instruments through which consciousness engages the manifest world. The role of disciplined study. This brings us to the essential importance of rigorous intellectual and practical discipline, precisely what the Hermetic school provides. The path we have outlined is not traversed through good intentions or casual interest, but through sustained, systematic engagement with the principles and practices encoded in the wisdom traditions. The modern seeker faces unique challenges: a cultural environment that either dismisses these teachings as superstition or commodifies them as self-help, a psychological landscape fragmented by trauma and overstimulation, an intellectual climate that oscillates between naive materialism and uncritical spirituality. Navigating this terrain requires both critical intelligence and experiential practice, the head and the heart in partnership. The study of Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalistic correspondences, alchemical symbolism, Jungian psychology provides the intellectual framework necessary to understand what one experiences. Without this framework, profound experiences may be misinterpreted, preliminary insights mistaken for ultimate realization, psychological inflation confused with spiritual awakening. Equally crucial is the disciplined engagement with practice, meditation, contemplation, active imagination, ritual work. Theory without practice produces arid intellectualism, the accumulation of concepts that never penetrate lived experience. Practice without theory produces confusion, powerful experiences without the map necessary to integrate them coherently. The Hermetic school maintains this essential balance. It refuses both the naive empiricism that dismisses centuries of accumulated wisdom and the credulous acceptance that abandons critical discernment. It recognizes that these teachings are not arbitrary inventions, but careful descriptions of reproducible inner experiences, tested and refined across generations of practitioners. The doctrine of the three bodies is not merely historical curiosity or exotic philosophy, but a practical map for the most urgent work any human being can undertake, the realization of their own complete nature. In an age of fragmentation and reductionism, this teaching offers integration. In an era of materialist despair, it points toward the dimension of spirit without demanding faith in unprovable dogmas. In a culture of psychological pathology, it distinguishes necessary crisis from destructive collapse. The moral imperative. There is, finally, a profound moral dimension to this work. The person who has realized the three bodies, who has integrated the psychological depths and recognized their spiritual essence, carries a responsibility. They have accessed a level of understanding and capacity that most never reach. What they do with this realization matters. The traditions are unanimous. Genuine spiritual attainment naturally overflows into service, not service driven by guilt or obligation, but action arising from recognition of unity. The Bodhisattva vow of Buddhism, the Christian call to be in the world but not of it, the Hermetic principle of as above, so below, enacted through bringing spiritual realization into material expression, all point to the same truth. Awakening is not for oneself alone, but for the liberation of all beings. This does not necessarily mean grand gestures or public teaching. It may manifest as simple presence, being a stabilizing force in one's community, modeling integrated consciousness through daily action, offering genuine meaning to those one encounters. The transformed person becomes, in their very being, a kind of transmission, evidence that the work is real, that consciousness can be transformed, that the three bodies can be brought into harmony. The ultimate paradox. We arrive finally at the great paradox that confounds all attempts to capture this teaching in words. The goal of the great work is the realization that there was never anything to attain, that the spirit body was always present, that consciousness was never actually identified with body or soul, but only believed itself to be. The entire journey, the shadow work, the archetypal encounters, the dark night, the integration, is consciousness waking up from the dream of limitation. Yet the journey cannot be skipped. The direct path, simply recognizing right now that you are consciousness itself, not body or personality, fails for most because the conditioned structures are too strong, the identifications too deep. The consciousness attempting to recognize itself is itself obscured by the very structures it is trying to see through. Thus, the necessity of the gradual path, systematically deconstructing identifications, purifying the soul body, creating the conditions in which recognition becomes possible. It is like cleaning a mirror. The mirror was always reflective. Its nature was never compromised by the dust that obscured it. Yet the dust must be removed for the reflectivity to manifest. The great work is the systematic removal of obstructions to the recognition of what has always been the case. The teaching of the three bodies provides the architecture for this cleaning, identifying the layers that must be worked with, the operations necessary at each level, the proper relationship between dimensions of being. It is both map and method, diagnosis and treatment, description and prescription. Closing reflection. For the sincere seeker reading these words, the question is not whether this teaching is true in some abstract sense, but whether it proves useful as a framework for understanding and transforming your own experience. Does the distinction between body, soul, and spirit clarify the confusion of ordinary consciousness? Do the stages of the path resonate with movements you recognize in your own psychological and spiritual development? Does this architecture provide orientation in the disorienting process of awakening? If so, the teaching has served its purpose. If not, it should be set aside in favor of frameworks that better illuminate your particular path. The map is not the territory. No teaching, however profound, can substitute for direct experience. But a good map can prevent years of wandering, can help distinguish productive crisis from pointless suffering, can offer hope in the darkness, that recognition is possible and that others have traversed this terrain before. The tradition of esoteric wisdom, transmitted through Hermetic philosophy, alchemical symbolism, Kabbalistic correspondence, and depth psychology represents humanity's accumulated understanding of consciousness and its transformation. To dismiss it as superstition is arrogant ignorance. To accept it uncritically is naive credulity. To engage it seriously, testing its propositions against lived experience while maintaining intellectual rigor, this is the path of the genuine adept. The Hermetic school exists to facilitate precisely this engagement, serious study and practice, undertaken with both commitment and discernment, neither dogmatic nor dismissive, pursuing the great work with the full resources of intellect, emotion, and spirit. For those called to this path, there is no substitute for disciplined, systematic engagement with the tradition. The Three Bodies Doctrine stands as one of the foundational teachings of this tradition, not because it is old or exotic, but because it accurately describes the structure of human being and the path of human becoming. Body, soul, and spirit, the trinity within, the threefold nature of consciousness itself, the architecture of transformation. To know this intellectually is the beginning. To experience it through systematic practice is the middle way. To embody it fully, living from the recognition of spirit while honoring soul and body, this is the completion that is also a new beginning, the attainment that reveals there was never anything to attain, the end of the path that opens onto the pathless. The gold you seek is not hidden in ancient texts or exotic practices, not concealed in distant ashrams or secret societies. It lies in the willing crucible of your own consciousness, in the fierce courage to confront what you have denied, in the patient endurance through the darkness of dissolution, in the steady recognition of the witness that observes all content, yet remains untouched by any. The fire that transmutes lead into gold is not external heat, but the concentrated light of awareness turned fully upon itself. The philosopher's stone is not achieved but realized, for you are already that which you seek, consciousness playing hide-and-seek with itself across three bodies, awaiting only the recognition that the seeker and the sought were never two.